Hey everyone, Steve here at SKS Props. Today we're going to make my version of Harley Quinn's Mallet. Welcome to the shop. In today's video, we're going to be putting together Harley Quinn's Mallet, at least my version of it. Now this is a very iconic weapon and it's synonymous with the character, so there are a ton of different iterations of it. I just wanted to put together my particular spin. Now this of course is made all out of my HD foam, which you guys can find over at Blick Art Materials, so that means that it's both lightweight and con-safe. Now this is going to be a two-part video series. Part one is going to go over all of the fabrication techniques, including all of the wood grain that I have going on here, and of course the leather wrapped handle. Part two is going to go over all the painting, so we're going to take this from a raw weapon to a fully finished work of art. We've got a lot to do to put this together, so let's go ahead and get started. I want my version of the mallet to be one-handed and not overly big, so I'm using an 11x17 template on 10mm HD foam. I'm going to use my heat gun, and of course I have my respirator. I'm going to lightly heat the foam. This is going to make it easier to manipulate. I'm going to roll the foam in one direction by hand and then back on itself. This is going to give the foam a subtle curve. I'm going to be using contact cement to adhere the two sides together. While the contact cement is drying, I add a little more heat just so the foam doesn't flatten out. I'm adding a little bit of super glue for my double adhesive method. I do need this seam to be pretty strong. Each side is carefully lined up and firmly pressed together. You want to make sure that this seam is as tight as possible, even though we're going to cover it up down the road. I need to make caps for both sides, so I take my ruler and measure the diameter of the end of the mallet. Looks like it's going to be right under 6 inches, so I break out my circle jig for my bandsaw and cut out 2 circles just under that size. After the circles have been cut out, contact cement is once again used to adhere the pieces to either side of the cylinder. I break out my Dremel rotary tool to clean up some of the edges, and I start to also detail some of the sides. Using my rotary tool, I start to carve in the rings on the face of the mallet. Now this is very important. You don't want them to be perfectly round or symmetrical. You want them to have an organic look. You can also help vary this look by how hard you press into the foam. The more detail is added to the face of this mallet, the rings are going to get smaller and smaller. So next up, we're going to be using a stone bit. This is going to allow me to get very clean, crisp lines all the way around. And for my final pass, I'm going to be using a wood burning tool set to the highest temperature. It is important to move quick with this tool and make sure that you're always wearing your respirator. I just want to take a minute to thank all of my Patreon supporters and those of you that have been purchasing my line of HD foam. Now, if you guys are buying my foam from Blick Art Materials, be sure to go through my website or the links below first, because I do receive a vendor affiliate and that allows me to continue to do what I do, which means more videos for you guys, more tips and tricks for prop and costume fabrication. Thank you guys so much for your continued support. More videos are on the way. Using a cloth tape measure, I figure out the middle of the mallet. This is where the handle is going to go through. To make sure I have perfect holes for my cardboard tube, I use a Forstner bit and drill from the bottom and the top. I lightly mark on the tube with a pencil exactly where my adhesive needs to go, and I go ahead and use some super glue along with some accelerator. This next step is what's going to separate this mallet from a lot of the other ones that are out there. This is going to have a very detailed bark section all the way around the outside of this mallet. To achieve this look, I'm going to randomly cut strips of 6mm and 10mm foam, not thinking about the shapes at all. Later on, I'll puzzle piece these pieces together, and that's what's going to give it that organic look. I would recommend to cut out more of these than you need, because a lot of them you're going to whittle down to fill in the gaps. The main thing here is I'm going to just eyeball where they go, but before I glue them down, I want to take my rotary tool and clean up the sides. I'm doing this step now because it'll make it easier to clean up these pieces later on. Because I'm covering a lot of the surface area, I'm going to be using contact cement once again. It's going to be applied to the sides of the mallet and to the back of each one of these pieces I've cut out. Once the contact cement is dry to the touch, it's literally me just going through my pile of scraps and seeing what pieces will work and where. Here's where I can see where a piece might work, but it's a little too long, so I go ahead and cut it off and then just add in smaller sections. If you get to a spot that just doesn't work, go ahead and cut some more foam or just bend one to shape. The main thing here is just varying the differences of the 6mm and 10mm foam all the way around the surface. This is what's going to give us that really organic look. Using a medium grit sanding drum on my Dremel rotary tool, I start to add in some of the grooves that will make up the basic look of this bark. Now at this point I'm not trying to add a bunch of details, this is just a roadmap for the direction of the piece. Just like the face of the mallet, I switch over to the small stone bit. This will help me sharpen and start to define some of these lines. So I've got the gouges in the foam, but the bark is still looking pretty flat. That's why this next step is crucial to the look. The sides of every single piece of 6mm and 10mm HD foam is dremeled almost all the way down to the sides of the original mallet. This allows the foam to take on a ton of texture and really get that organic bark look. I mean, it's a night and day difference between the side I haven't worked on yet. And once you've got that finished up, go ahead and hit it with a heat gun to seal off all the foam. Next up, I'm going to be working on the leather wrapped handle. In this case, I'm using 2mm HD foam. Now for the hand section, I want it to have a checkered pattern basket weave look. So to do this, I'm going to have 1-inch strips of the 2mm foam, and these each are going to be 9 inches long. I'm going to start at one end, and the 9-inch strips are glued on either side of this piece. After those had set up, additional strips are woven in, one on top of the other, and those are glued into place. This will give the handle a little more texture and I think just visually make it more appealing. This woven foam is then cut to fit and marked on the handle with a pencil. Because this is going to be a heavy wear area, contact cement is once again going to be used to adhere the foam to the handle. Once the handle had been pressed firmly all the way around, additional adhesive was used to close the gap. Now for the top of the handle, I'm not going to have it as ornate. I'm just going to use a very long strip of 2mm HD foam and spiral that down the cardboard. This strip of foam is just tacked into place using super glue. When designing this mallet, I really wanted Harley to have a place to put her logo, so in this case I'm going to do a leather wrap all around the top of the mallet. The basic shape of this leather wrap was first drawn out onto some Bristol board and then transferred onto 2mm HD foam. That was then cut out using a utility knife. Additional strips of 2mm HD foam were glued around the bottom of it. This is to make it look like this wrap actually attaches. I want everything about this mount to look as though it has a purpose. That's also why I spent all that time carving the bark of this wood, even though I'm going to be covering it up, because if I hadn't done it right, it wouldn't look good in the end. I use a mixture of contact cement and super glue to adhere down this leather wrap around the top. At the ends of the mallet, I'm going to be using strips of 6mm foam to look like metal bandings. Visually, this will give the appearance that they're keeping the wood from splitting on the ends. Since the bands aren't going to get a lot of wear and tear, I just use super glue to glue them down. For the band at the top of the handle, I used a strip of 10mm HD foam. Notice that I cut it at a sharp angle. This will help minimize the seam. I also glued 1-inch circles of 10mm HD foam to the bottom and top of the handle to cover the holes. To give all the strips a hammered metal look, I used a medium grit sanding drum attached to my Dremel rotary tool. To make it look as though the woven handle wrap was stitched, I first drilled out the handle and then cut strips of 2mm HD foam. These were then glued and pressed into the holes that I had previously drilled out. This is one thing that's great about my 2mm HD foam, is that it has more stretch than any of the other foams that are on the market because of its higher density. So it works great for these faux applications where it looks like it's sewed or tied. After it looked like it was all stitched one way, I then took my additional strips and glued them in the opposite direction. In the end, it really does look like a leather stitch and gives that additional detail to the piece. To keep with the look of realism and that everything is functional, I cut out a ton of these little rivet heads and started gluing them to all the leather pieces. When placing my rivets, I actually had to make sure that they looked like they were going into the raised sections of the wood. I also added a few to the metal bands. To simulate some small tacks on the leather wrap, I did the pin technique, where you just take the end of a pin and press it firmly and twist into the foam. To give this leather a worn and tattered look, I'm going to go ahead and do the tinfoil technique. This is achieved by lightly heating up the foam, crumpling up some tinfoil, and pressing it firmly into the surface. This will actually emboss it. This same texture is applied to the faux leather handle wrap. It's a small detail now, but makes a huge difference when you dry brush later on. Last fabrication step, we got Harley's logo, and for this I'm going to do 3 diamonds on either side. The diamond patterns were drawn out and then traced onto some 2mm HD foam. These pieces were then lightly marked with a pencil on the side of the hammer to make sure I lined them up properly. Once I was satisfied, they were glued into place and the tinfoil technique was also applied to them. So you guys can see some of the techniques that I implemented to put together this iconic weapon, at least my version of it. Now, I'm really proud of how the wood grain on this came out, and I really enjoyed the leather wrap on this handle. This is the kind of stuff that I'm excited to put out there because I want to see you guys implement it in future builds. And if you guys are enjoying these videos, be sure to give them a thumbs up and share them with your friends and family. And remember, if you're building any of my builds or using HD foam, be sure to tag SKS Props on Twitter and Instagram because I love seeing your progress. Until next time, build your best with the best HD foam.